I want to walk you through the problem I had with this chipper. It's a Merrimack chipper shredder, and it's equipped with Briggs and Stratton 10 horsepower engine. And I've got it here. It's a little tough to see in this light, but it's your typical horizontal shaft Briggs pull start. 10 horsepower overhead valve. And basically, it's a neighbor. He got a hold of me and said, "Hey, my engine, which I've already got apart and diagnosed, won't start." And he's pulling it over, pulling it over, pulling it over, and notice it's real hard to pull the pull starter. And so I went over with him to try to get it figured out, and it was hard to pull over. So hard that I ripped the rope trying to pull it, and the what it felt like was you'd go to pull and it would pull easy for a second, then it would really bind like on compression, but almost like even more difficult than a normal compression. And so, wanting to do the keep it simple stupid method, I said, well, let's check for fuel, check for spark, and there's a couple of ways that I would suggest doing that. And one was just real simply, the spark plug lives down in here, and so what I like to do is pull the spark plug, um, cable off, disconnect the spark plug, and then undo the spark plug, actually unthread it from the cylinder head, plug the spark plug in here, and then lay it against something that's grounded. Like I'll show you what that looks like right now. Okay, so I hooked the spark plug back into the cable here, and then, when we tested, I just kind of laid it up on the muffler, which is obviously grounded. And at that time, we just went and pulled the regular pull starter and made sure that we had the throttle on. And, it was sparking, small little sparks. So I figured, well, hey, it's got good spark. Cleaned it up anyway, but that would kind of indicate that spark was good. The other way I like to check for fuel is there's one of two things. With the ethanol fuel, and it gets ethanol kind of separates from the actual gasoline, and it tends to attract water. You could go ahead, you could just smell it. This one seemed to smell okay, but who's to say that it doesn't have a big bunch of water that's getting down in the carburetor? So what I like to do is take a glass, fairly clean one, and just take a fuel sample by disconnecting the fuel line. A lot of times where it goes into the carburetor here, pull that cover, which I just put the cover back on, but pull that hose, put it into the bottle, let it sit for 5 to 10 minutes, and see if you see any water and fuel separation. With this one passed, the next thing I like to do is just go ahead, pop the air filter off, the cover, the air filter, open up the carburetor, shoot a little bit of starting fluid or maybe carburetor cleaner. It'll even run a little bit on WD-40. And I sprayed it in there and pulled it over, and kind of what we were getting was, as I would pull it over, again, it would be hard to pull, it would pop, it would kind of backfire, it would seem like it was having some fuel and some spark that's causing combustion, but it wouldn't actually really start up. So then, being that it was hard to pull over, I started looking at more like mechanical things. So this thing has a big clutch on it that drives the belt. So I just tensioned it, detensioned it, and pulled the belt off to make sure that it was nothing in the machine that was binding it up and making it difficult to turn. Once the belt was off, I re-pulled it, and it was still pulling really hard. So at this point, it's really looking to me like an engine mechanical thing. And so my background's mostly automotive, so I had some ideas in my head that are a little different than small engine, but it would be probably good to have done a compression test with a compression tester. But just based on the fact that I know it's getting good spark and good fuel, and I know sometimes these have a tendency to shear a keyway and have timing get messed up, and some things that I went ahead and I pulled this side engine cover. It's almost like an oil pan in a sense, and there were just a handful of bolts in there, So pretty easy to just pop the engine out. 4 bolts hold it down to the deck here. And go ahead and pop those bolts off. I pulled this, and in my mind, I was expecting, because I'm an automotive guy, I'm expecting a lot of times the stuff that we see is the rod bearing would, have had some dirt and maybe have spun a bearing or, had some things. So I went ahead and popped this rod apart, and you can see some scoring in there. And, that was obviously a problem for me. There are no bearings. It's just an aluminum cap, and so it wears right into the cap directly. To do this, by the way, you'd want to drain the oil. And when I did drain the oil into my bucket over there, I noticed some metal, but nothing really large, so it wasn't real conclusive. So I went ahead and I popped the rod apart, and I noticed it's obviously much easier to turn, but I wasn't convinced that was really the issue, and so I kind of backtracked. I pulled the camshaft out, and at this time I know there's an internal engine problem. I just don't really know what it is, but I backtracked, and I decided I'd go up here, and I would. This is your valve cover. By the way, if you're looking for the engine serial numbers, go ahead and pull your valve cover off. I had already taken those 4 3/8 bolts, and here's your model number. That's pretty much all the information your engine has. So I went ahead and I pulled that, and I thought, it pulling over doesn't really make a lot of sense. It pulling over hard doesn't really sound like a valve adjustment. That doesn't make a lot of sense, but I figured I'd go ahead and just check it, and they felt a little funny, so I went ahead and I looked down here, and sure enough, I pulled out one of these followers or tappets, and this is what I found. A bent push rod. And it was on the exhaust side, and logically it would kind of make sense if you look at this engine. Carburetor's here, meaning this is the intake valve. Muffler's here, meaning this is the exhaust valve. And so I found that this exhaust valve, this exhaust push rod was bent, which obviously the bottom end of the engine is turning okay. As the camshaft rolls over, there's no real wear on the cam. It looks like a decompression mechanism here is looking okay. And so I figured logically, if the bottom end is turning and this tappet is pushing up on this push rod and it bent, there's obviously something stopping it from moving. So I went ahead over to this valve, and this is where this video might actually really be helpful if you're having this issue. Here's the intake valve, and if I just grab that rocker and I push, I can move that intake valve, not a problem. But if I grab the exhaust rocker arm and try to push, I've not been able to move this sucker at all. So I don't really know the initial cause, but I could tell you that this 10 horsepower Briggs & Stratton has got a seized exhaust valve. So I'm probably not going to bother pulling the head and seeing if it's the valve guide, which I'd imagine it's a valve guide or something similar. And so hopefully that kind of helps you. But my logic is, when we were pulling it over and it was kind of like binding, what I had envisioned was obviously it's not able to move that exhaust valve, but since it's no longer actuating the exhaust valve, that would mean in the intake stroke, it pulls in air. Compression stroke, it's compressing. It would get a good spark, and there would be air and fuel, so it would start to combust. It would do one power stroke, then in the very next stroke, the exhaust valve would not open, and so at that point, it would stop. It would stall it immediately. It wouldn't even get a full 4-stroke cycle in, and so I'd attribute that mainly to that exhaust valve not opening. And the spent exhaust gases never being relieved from the cylinder, so that was causing this thing to be hard to pull. I didn't see any other videos on this exact thing, so I wanted to share it. So maybe in retrospect, the check would be: don't pull the engine apart. Simply pull the spark plug, pull the valve cover, grab your rocker arms, and and see if you turn the engine over. See if these rocker arms are moving the exhaust valve, and this one would have not been moving because the push rod was bent, and it obviously couldn't move that exhaust valve. So hopefully that helps somebody. And just maybe for reference, this being the 10 horsepower, it's a model 205432 type 0036E2, and I'm looking at a replacement engine at this point.